March 6, 1836. The Alamo falls silent. The smoke clears. And the man who was supposed to die swinging his rifle, America's greatest frontier hero, is standing. Alive. On his knees. Hands bound. And the most powerful general in Mexico is looking at him with cold eyes. What happened next was buried for over a century. This is the secret they didn't want you to know. The Alamo's last secret, the execution of a legend. The myth America built. For nearly 2 centuries, the story was airtight. On the morning of March 6, 1836, somewhere inside the crumbling walls of a Spanish mission-turned-makeshift fortress in San Antonio, Texas, a man died the way Americans needed him to die. His name was David Crockett, Davy to the world, and the version passed down through history books, painted across Hollywood screens, and carved into the bedrock of American identity went something like this. He fought until the very last moment, swinging his beloved rifle Old Betsy like a war club after the powder ran dry, surrounded by heaps of dead Mexican soldiers, going down in a blaze that would have made any frontier legend proud. That was the story. It was clean. It was heroic. It sold millions of coonskin caps to children across America in the 1950s. Walt Disney immortalized it. John Wayne embodied it. A nation hungry for mythic ancestors consumed it whole. But buried beneath that legend, locked inside a diary that would vanish, resurface, be authenticated, and spark one of the most vicious debates in American historical scholarship, was a different truth. A truth so uncomfortable that for over 100 years, powerful men actively worked to suppress it. The real story of Davy Crockett's death at the Alamo does not end with a heroic swing of a rifle. It ends on his knees. Bound. Facing a firing squad. On the direct orders of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. This is that story. The man before the myth. To understand what Davy Crockett was doing inside the Alamo on March 6, 1836, you need to understand what he was running from. By the mid-1830s, Crockett was already a legend in his own lifetime, a 3-term U.S. congressman from Tennessee, bear hunter, storyteller, and frontier celebrity whose autobiography had been a bestseller. But in 1835, he lost his congressional seat in a bitter political defeat, largely because he had broken with the Democratic Party and President Andrew Jackson over a policy that forced Native American tribes from their ancestral lands at Bayonet Point. Crockett called it what it was, ethnic cleansing, and paid for his honesty with his political career. Humiliated and financially ruined, he reportedly told his Tennessee constituents, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." It was not entirely a joke. Texas in 1835 was the frontier of frontiers, a wild, contested land where a man with nothing left could reinvent himself completely. Anglo-American settlers had been flooding into Mexican Texas for over a decade, many of them bringing enslaved people with them, despite Mexican law explicitly prohibiting slavery in its territory. When Mexico's President Santa Anna centralized power and moved to enforce those laws, including cracking down on the illegal slave economy, the Anglo settlers revolted. Crockett arrived in San Antonio on February 8, 1836, with a small band of Tennessee volunteers. He had not come to die for Texas independence as a matter of ideology. He had come because Texas was the only frontier big enough to contain a myth in need of rebuilding. He joined the garrison at the Alamo under Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett Travis, a 26-year-old lawyer-playing soldier, brilliant, passionate, and dangerously overconfident. What Crockett walked into was not a fortress. It was a death trap. The trap is set. The Alamo mission was never built to be defended militarily. It was a church compound, sprawling, poorly walled, with more gaps than defenses. Military experts at the time, including Sam Houston himself, advised abandoning it. The garrison holding it numbered somewhere between 185 and 250 men, depending on which account you trust. Some were seasoned fighters. Many were farmers, doctors, and adventurers with no military training whatsoever. Against them, General Santa Anna, marching north with an army that would swell to over 2,500 soldiers. He arrived on February 23, 1836, and immediately raised a blood-red flag from the bell tower of a nearby church. No quarter. No mercy. No prisoners. Every man inside those walls would die. Travis fired a cannon in defiance and sent out urgent letters begging for reinforcements. One of those letters is among the most extraordinary documents in American history, addressed to all Americans and all friends of liberty, declaring victory or death as the only options the garrison would accept. Only 32 men answered that call, riding in from Gonzales on March 1. It was a noble gesture. It changed nothing mathematically. Inside the Alamo, as the siege stretched from days into nearly 2 weeks, the men lived under constant artillery bombardment, surviving on dwindling food and water, watching the Mexican lines grow thicker every night. Travis supposedly drew a line in the sand with his sword and asked every man willing to die for Texas to cross it and stand beside him. Only one man, Moses Rose, a French mercenary, allegedly refused and slipped away in the darkness. Whether that line was literally drawn or is itself a part of myth is debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is what happened before dawn on March 6, 1836. The final assault. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, under cover of darkness and in near total silence, more than 1,800 Mexican soldiers moved into attack positions on four sides of the Alamo compound. Santa Anna had given specific orders: no bugle calls, no warning, overwhelming and immediate force. Then the bugles erupted, playing the ancient Moorish war call known as the Degelo, the throat-cutting song. It meant, we take no prisoners. It meant, everyone inside those walls is already dead. The Texians woke to screaming. The north wall was breached first. Mexican soldiers poured over the crumbled stone like a flood that cannot be stopped. The courtyard became a killing ground. The fight inside the compound was savage, close quarters, intimate in its brutality, men killing each other with bayonets, rifle butts, and bare hands in the gray half-light of dawn. Travis was dead within minutes, shot in the forehead on the north wall, collapsing against his own cannon. Jim Bowie, the legendary knife fighter, was already gravely ill, bedridden with what was likely typhoid or tuberculosis. Accounts differ on how he died. Some say he was dragged from his cot and bayoneted. Others say he fired his pistols from his sickbed until the room was overrun. The defenders made their last stands in the long barracks, in the chapel, in every corner and room that could be held for another minute, another breath. But the Alamo compound stretched across 3 acres. There were never enough men to hold every wall, every gate, every gap. Within 90 minutes of the first shot, it was over. But not entirely. Not for everyone. The survivors Santa Anna wasn't supposed to find. Here is where history splits into 2 roads, and where the buried truth begins. As the smoke settled over the devastated compound, Mexican General Martín Perfecto de Cos, Santa Anna's brother-in-law, found a small group of men still alive in a far corner of the barracks. They had been flushed from their positions but had not fought to the death. They had survived. There were between 5 and 7 of them, depending on the account. One of them was David Crockett. General Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, a career officer, a man of military honor, old enough to understand the difference between justice and brutality, took these survivors under his personal protection. He marched them across the blood-soaked courtyard to present them to Santa Anna. Perhaps he believed Santa Anna would spare them as prisoners of war. Perhaps he believed their lives had value, as evidence, as symbols of Mexican magnanimity, as bargaining chips for the negotiations that would inevitably follow. He was wrong. Santa Anna looked at the survivors, tired, battered, unarmed, and felt nothing but contempt. According to his own personal secretary, Ramon Martinez Caro, who was present that morning, Santa Anna turned to his officers and ordered the immediate execution of all prisoners. Some of his officers reportedly recoiled. Castrillon himself was said to have argued passionately for mercy. It made no difference. The executions were carried out with bayonets. David Crockett, the king of the wild frontier, United States congressman, frontier legend, author, and symbol of American rugged individualism, was not killed in glorious battle swinging his rifle. He was executed. Unarmed. In the dust of a courtyard. By order of a general who considered him nothing more than an illegal insurgent. The diary that changed everything. The primary evidence for this account comes from a document that sat in obscurity for over a century before exploding into one of the most heated controversies in the history of the American West. Colonel José Enrique de la Pena was a Mexican army officer who served under Santa Anna during the Texas campaign. He was not Santa Anna's loyalist, he was a critic, a man of conscience who was deeply troubled by what he witnessed. After returning to Mexico, he wrote a detailed personal memoir of the campaign, including a vivid, specific account of what happened to the survivors found after the fall of the Alamo. De la Pena wrote that a small number of defenders, including one man he described as a famous frontiersman from the American North who had come to Texas seeking new adventures, were brought before Santa Anna alive. He described the man's dignity and composure even as a prisoner. He described Santa Anna's cold order. He described the executions that followed, carried out with swords and bayonets, while some of the Mexican officers present turned their faces away in shame. The diary was published in Spanish in Mexico in 1955, over a century after the battle. It was translated into English in 1975 and published by Texas A&M University Press. The reaction in certain quarters of Texas was volcanic. Because the diary didn't just challenge the myth of Davy Crockett. It challenged the entire carefully constructed architecture of the Alamo legend, the noble last stand, the victory or death ethos, the foundational mythology of Texas independence. If Crockett had surrendered, even if he'd surrendered only at the very end, when the battle was already irretrievably lost, then the story Texas had built its identity upon was not entirely true. Some historians accepted the diary's account as credible, noting that it was corroborated by multiple other contemporary Mexican sources, including Santa Anna's own secretary. Others declared it a forgery, a conspiracy, a deliberate attack on American heroism by forces who wished to diminish the Alamo's meaning. The battle over a dead man's reputation had begun. The Authentication War. 4 decades after its English publication, the De La Pena diary sat at the center of a historical firefight that was never just about history. One camp, led by historians like James E. Crisp of North Carolina State University, argued rigorously for the diary's authenticity, cross-referencing its details with other contemporary accounts, linguistic analysis of the Spanish text, and the documented history of its chain of custody. Crisp's 2005 book, Sleuthing the Alamo, laid out this case with meticulous academic precision. The other camp, led by figures like Bill Groneman, a New York fire marshal turned Alamo researcher, argued that the diary showed evidence of later forgery, that certain passages had been inserted after the fact to create the Crockett execution narrative. Groneman's 1994 book, Defense of a Legend, became the Bible for those who refused to let the myth go without a fight. In 1998, the diary was subjected to forensic testing, ink analysis, paper aging, physical examination of the document itself. The conclusion of the forensic investigators, the document was consistent with 19th-century origin. It was not a modern forgery. In 2001, the diary was auctioned at Sotheby's in New York, sold to a private collector for $350,000. The sale itself became a flashpoint. Texas politicians and preservation groups argued that such a foundational document should not be in private hands. But even as the physical document changed hands, the historical debate it had ignited could not be bought, sold, or settled. Why the myth was built, and who built it. The De La Pena controversy cannot be understood without understanding why the original myth was constructed in the first place, and who benefited from it. Immediately after the fall of the Alamo, the Republic of Texas needed heroes. Sam Houston's army was in retreat, Texas independence was not yet secured, and the Texan public was terrified. The deaths at the Alamo needed to mean something enormous. They needed to be transformed from a military disaster into a sacred sacrifice. Enter Reuben Potter, a Texas Army officer and early historian who would shape the first major American narratives of the battle. Potter's accounts, written in the 1840s and 1850s, established several key elements of the Alamo mythology: the line in the sand, the unanimous choice to stay and die, and most importantly, the idea that every single defender went down fighting. No surrender. No prisoners. Victory or death, exactly as Travis had promised. Reports of survivors being executed, which were circulating in Texas newspapers as early as March 11, 1836, 5 days after the battle, were quietly ignored. Accounts that mentioned Crockett's surrender were buried, dismissed, or reframed. The myth served purposes beyond mere pride. The narrative of noble self-sacrifice at the Alamo became the moral engine that powered the Texas Revolution's conclusion. "Remember the Alamo," was the battle cry at San Jacinto 6 weeks later, when Houston's army crushed Santa Anna's forces in a surprise attack that lasted just 18 minutes. That cry required the Alamo's defenders to be martyrs, not prisoners, heroes, not executed captives. By the time John Wayne made his 1960 film, the myth had calcified into national religion. Questioning it felt not merely revisionist, but unpatriotic. The other voices history ignored. De La Pena was not the only Mexican voice describing survivors at the Alamo. Ramon Martinez Caro, Santa Anna's personal secretary who was present at the battle, wrote in his own account that 5 men were found alive after the fighting and brought to Santa Anna, who ordered them killed. The number differs slightly from De La Pena's account, but the essential facts are identical. Survivors existed, they were brought before Santa Anna, and he had them executed. General Vicente Filisola, one of Santa Anna's senior commanders, wrote in his own memoirs that a handful of Texans had surrendered and were subsequently killed on Santa Anna's direct orders. Filisola, who became increasingly critical of Santa Anna after the campaign, described the executions as an act of unnecessary cruelty that violated the norms of civilized warfare. General Joaquin Ramirez y Sesma's accounts also mention Texians who fled or surrendered and were pursued and killed by Mexican lancers outside the walls of the compound. All of these accounts agree on a fundamental point that the American myth could not accommodate. Not every Alamo defender died with a rifle in his hand. Some fled. Some were overwhelmed. Some surrendered. And those who surrendered were killed not in battle but by deliberate executive order. The Mexican perspective on the Alamo, suppressed, dismissed, or simply never taught in American schools, has always told a more complicated story. What really happened inside those final minutes? Piecing together the most credible accounts from multiple sources, this is what the historical evidence suggests actually happened to David Crockett on the morning of March 6, 1836. As the Mexican assault overwhelmed the final defenders, Crockett and a small group of his Tennessee volunteers found themselves in a section of the barracks where continued resistance had become literally impossible, surrounded, out of powder, cornered by overwhelming numbers. The choice was not between fighting and surrendering. The choice was between being bayoneted where they stood and raising their hands. They raised their hands. General Castrillon found them and took them under his protection, a decision that reflects genuine military honor and that Castrillon clearly believed Santa Anna would respect. Santa Anna did not respect it. When the prisoners were brought before him, Santa Anna reportedly did not even look at them long before giving the order. His officers, including Castrillon, protested. Castrillon, by some accounts, placed himself between the prisoners and the soldiers ordered to kill them and told Santa Anna directly that this was a stain on Mexico's honor. Santa Anna brushed the objection aside. The execution was swift. It was brutal. The bodies were left where they fell, then piled with the other dead and burned on Santa Anna's orders, a final act of contempt that denied the defenders even a traditional burial. Eyewitnesses described the scene as one of the most disturbing moments of an already savage morning. Even hardened soldiers who had been fighting since dawn were reported to have wept. David Crockett died not as a legend but as a man who had come to Texas looking for a second act and found instead the final curtain, at the age of 49, in a dusty courtyard he'd known for less than a month. The legacy of the lie. Why does any of this matter, nearly 2 centuries later? Because the lie that replaced the truth was not a harmless embellishment. It was a deliberate act of national myth-making that served specific political, racial, and ideological purposes, and understanding those purposes illuminates something essential about how nations construct their identities. The Alamo myth was built at a moment when Texas needed to justify its separation from Mexico and its preservation of slavery. The defenders of the Alamo were fighting, in significant part, to protect an illegal slave economy that Mexico had abolished. Transforming them into universal heroes of freedom, stripped of their specific historical context, required erasing the voices of everyone who told a more complicated story. That included the Mexican soldiers and officers who were present, the Tejano Texans who fought alongside the Anglo settlers and whose perspectives were frequently ignored in the Anglo-dominated retelling, and the historical record itself. The truth, that some defenders surrendered, that Crockett among them was executed by order of a general who had the legal authority, by the brutal standards of the era, to classify them as pirates and insurgents, is not a diminishment of anyone's courage. Men who fight knowing they will probably die are brave regardless of how their final moments unfold. Crockett had crossed half a continent to be inside those walls. He had spent 13 days under bombardment without breaking. His surrender at the end was not cowardice, it was the last rational act of a man who had done everything humanly possible. What diminishes those men is not the truth of their deaths. It is the machine that replaced their complex humanity with a cardboard mythology that required their deaths to be cinematically perfect. The Alamo today and the history we still debate. The De La Pena diary remains in private hands. The debate it ignited has never fully closed. In recent years, a wave of revisionist scholarship, including Brian Burrow, Chris Tomlinson, and Jason Stanford's 2021 book Forget the Alamo, and the enormous public controversy it generated in Texas, has pushed the question of what the Alamo really means into uncomfortable new territory. Texas officials initially blocked a museum exhibit that included perspectives on the role of slavery in the Texas Revolution. The Alamo itself, the physical site in the heart of San Antonio, is managed by the Texas General Land Office and remains one of the most visited historical sites in America. It draws over 1.5 million visitors per year. Many of them come looking for the myth. Some leave with something closer to the truth. The stone walls still stand, patched and preserved, surrounded now by the glass and steel of a modern American city. The bullet holes have been filled. The blood has long since washed away. But underneath the manicured heritage site, underneath the bronze plaques and the reverent museum displays, the ghost of March 6, 1836 still refuses to rest quietly. Because the question that David Crockett's death forces us to confront is not just what happened in that courtyard. It is this: when a nation decides that a hero's true story is less useful than a beautiful lie, who does that choice serve, and who does it silence? The Alamo's last secret was never really a secret. It was in the Mexican accounts from the beginning. It was in the letters and diaries of the soldiers who were there. It was waiting, patiently, for nearly a century and a half, for someone to choose the complicated truth over the comfortable legend. Now you know. Remember the Alamo, all of it.